After the destruction of atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world did not become safer. It became more afraid. For the first time in history, humanity had created a weapon capable of ending civilization. Cities could disappear in seconds. Millions could die in a single moment. And every nation understood the same terrifying truth. If one country had the bomb, others would soon follow. The United States had ended World War II with atomic fire. But victory did not bring peace. Instead, it created a new enemy, the Soviet Union. Once allies against Nazi Germany, the two superpowers quickly became rivals. Suspicion replaced trust. Fear replaced cooperation. Both nations began building nuclear weapons. Bigger bombs, stronger bombs, faster delivery systems. This was no longer about winning battles. It was about survival. Because if war came again, there might be no survivors. Children in America practiced hiding under desks. Families built shelters underground. Sirens became symbols of a future that might never come. Across the ocean, the Soviet people lived with the same fear. The world had entered the Cold War, a war without gunfire, but filled with tension. A war of spies, secrets, and silent threats. Every crisis could be the last. Every misunderstanding could trigger destruction. And in the middle of this growing fear, a small island became the center of the world. Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. In 1959, a revolution changed everything. A young leader, Fidel Castro, overthrew the government and took control of the island. At first, many did not see the danger. But soon, Cuba moved closer to the Soviet Union. For the United States, this was a nightmare. An enemy so close to home. Tensions escalated quickly. The American government attempted to remove Castro. In 1961, they supported an invasion. The Bay of Pigs. It failed, humiliating the United States, strengthening Castro, and pushing Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, saw an opportunity. If Cuba could be defended, it could also be used. He knew the United States had missiles in Europe. Missiles pointed directly at the Soviet Union. So he made a bold decision. Secretly place nuclear missiles in Cuba, close enough to strike American cities within minutes. It was a dangerous gamble. If discovered, it could start a nuclear war. But if successful, it would change the balance of power. Ships began crossing the Atlantic, carrying soldiers, equipment, and nuclear weapons. Everything was done in secret. The world had no idea what was coming. But in October 1962, that silence would end. And for 13 days, humanity would stand on the edge of extinction. In October 1962, the silence ended. For months, Soviet ships had crossed the ocean, arriving in Cuba under strict secrecy. Crates were unloaded at night. Construction sites were hidden. Camouflage covered the landscape. But secrets in the Cold War rarely lasted. On the morning of October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane flew high above Cuba. Its mission was routine: photograph the island, search for military activity. Nothing unusual was expected. But when the images returned to Washington, everything changed. Analysts stared at the photographs in disbelief. Long shadows stretched across the ground. Missile launch sites, fuel tanks, support vehicles. There was no doubt. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. For the first time in history, American cities were minutes away from destruction. New York, Washington, Chicago. Millions of lives could vanish in seconds. The images reached the White House. President John F. Kennedy was informed. At first, the room was silent. Then the questions began. How long had the missiles been there? Were they operational? How many were hidden? No one had clear answers. What they did know was terrifying. If the missiles became fully active, the United States would be defenseless. There would be no time to respond. Kennedy gathered his closest advisors. Military leaders demanded immediate action. Airstrikes, invasion, total destruction of the missile sites. They believed hesitation would be fatal. But the president hesitated because he understood something deeper. An attack could trigger nuclear war. The Soviet Union might retaliate. Europe could burn. Cities across the world could disappear. Human civilization could collapse. For days, secret meetings filled the White House. The group became known as XCOM-MEM. Every decision was debated. Every option was dangerous. Some argued that strength was the only language the Soviet Union understood. Others warned that a single mistake could end humanity. Meanwhile, the American public knew nothing. Life continued. Children went to school. Workers went to their jobs. Families watched television, unaware that the world was closer to destruction than ever before. Kennedy chose a different path. Instead of immediate attack, he ordered a naval blockade. The goal was simple: stop Soviet ships from reaching Cuba. Force negotiation. But the risk remained. If a Soviet ship refused to stop, what would happen? Would American forces open fire? And if they did, would nuclear war begin? On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the nation. For the first time, the world learned the truth. Fear spread instantly. People rushed to stores. Families prepared shelters. Some believed the end had already begun. Across the ocean, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev watched the speech. He now faced a choice as dangerous as Kennedy's: back down or confront the United States. And as Soviet ships moved closer to the American blockade, the distance between peace and nuclear war became thinner than ever. For 13 days, every hour would matter. And the next decision could destroy the world. The world was holding its breath. American warships formed a line across the Atlantic, a visible barrier between peace and catastrophe. This was no longer politics. This was confrontation. Soviet cargo ships were moving toward Cuba. Some carried supplies. Some carried military equipment. And possibly more nuclear components. If they crossed the blockade, American forces had orders to stop them. But what did stop mean? Inspection. Boarding. Gunfire. No one knew how the first shot might be fired. Inside the White House, tension filled every room. President John F. Kennedy understood that history was narrowing into a single moment. If a ship refused to turn back, the United States would have to act. And once force was used, there might be no return. Across the ocean, Nikita Khrushchev faced equal pressure. Soviet military leaders warned that retreat would signal weakness. They argued that backing down could damage Soviet credibility worldwide. But escalation meant something far worse. On October 24th, the ships approached the blockade line. American radar tracked every movement. Binoculars scanned the horizon. The distance shrank. 20 miles. 10 miles. 5 miles. In command centers, hands hovered over communication devices. Every second felt heavier. And then, some of the Soviet ships slowed, then stopped, then turned around. For a brief moment, relief spread. Had catastrophe been avoided? Not yet. Because beneath the surface of the ocean, another danger was moving silently. Soviet submarines were near the blockade. Unlike the ships above, these submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. The American Navy did not know this, and the submarines had lost contact with Moscow. Inside one of them, deep underwater, the situation became desperate. The submarine was overheating. Air was running low. Communication systems were failing. American ships began dropping small depth charges, warning signals meant to force the submarine to surface. But inside the Soviet vessel, the crew did not know they were only warnings. They believed war might have already begun. The captain considered launching the nuclear torpedo. If he fired it, an American aircraft carrier would be destroyed. The United States would retaliate. Nuclear war would begin. Inside the cramped, overheated submarine, voices argued. Some believed they were already under attack, that they had no choice. Others urged restraint. One man's decision would determine the fate of the world. And in that suffocating darkness, the launch was denied. The submarine surfaced instead. Humanity had survived by a single decision. But the crisis was far from over. Back in Washington, new intelligence arrived. Missile sites in Cuba were becoming operational. Time was running out. Military leaders renewed their demands for airstrikes. They warned that hesitation would make the missiles untouchable. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Soviet technicians worked day and night. If the missiles became active, they could reach Washington in minutes. The pressure on Kennedy intensified. The pressure on Khrushchev intensified. The pressure on the world intensified. For 13 days, humanity lived in uncertainty. No social media. No instant updates. Just rumors. Radio broadcasts. And fear. Parents wondered if their children would grow up. Soldiers prepared for orders they prayed would never come. Leaders stared at maps, calculating destruction in numbers that barely felt human. And then, the crisis took another turn. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot was killed. Now blood had been spilled. Was this the first act of war? Or a tragic mistake? The next move would define history. And the world was still standing on the edge. By the end of October 1962, the world was closer to nuclear war than ever before. The shooting down of the American spy plane had changed everything. Inside the White House, the mood turned darker. Military leaders pushed harder. They argued that the time for diplomacy had ended. They warned that every hour increased the danger. If the missiles in Cuba became fully operational, the United States would lose its advantage. President John F. Kennedy faced a terrible reality. An invasion could trigger global destruction, but waiting could be just as deadly. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev felt the same pressure. His generals demanded strength. They feared humiliation. They feared losing credibility. But Khrushchev also understood something few others did. If nuclear war began, there would be no victory. Only ashes. Then, a message arrived in Washington. A letter from Khrushchev. It was emotional, personal, almost desperate. He wrote about the horrors of war, about cities destroyed, about mothers losing children. He warned that if both sides continued down this path, the world would not survive. And he offered a solution. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. For a moment, hope appeared, but the next day, another message arrived. This one was different, colder, more aggressive. It demanded more. The United States must also remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. Now, the crisis became even more dangerous. Accepting the demand publicly would make America appear weak. Rejecting it could mean war. Inside the White House, the debates were fierce. Some advisors urged acceptance. Others warned it would damage global trust. But Kennedy realized something critical. The first letter had come from Khrushchev himself. The second may have been written under pressure, perhaps by military leaders. perhaps by hardliners, perhaps by fear. So Kennedy made a bold decision. He would respond only to the first message. He would ignore the second. And privately, he would agree to remove the missiles from Turkey later. It was a secret compromise, a quiet solution to a loud crisis. But even as negotiations continued, time was slipping away. American forces prepared for invasion. Soviet forces in Cuba prepared for defense. Nuclear weapons were already on the island, and the commanders had authority to use them if attacked. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, one nervous soldier, and the world could end. Back channels open, secret meetings, hidden communications. Both leaders searched for a path out. Both understood the same truth. The longer the crisis lasted, the higher the risk. Then, on October 28th, a final message arrived. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles. The United States would promise not to invade Cuba. The world stepped back from the edge. But the tension did not disappear, because everyone now understood something terrifying. The world had come within minutes of nuclear war. And it could happen again. On October 28, 1962, the message spread across the world. The Soviet Union had agreed to remove the nuclear missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over, but the fear did not disappear. For 13 days, humanity had lived on the edge of extinction. And now, the silence that followed felt almost unreal. In the United States, people returned to their routines. Children went back to school. Families left their shelters. But something had changed. They now understood how fragile the world truly was. In Moscow, relief was just as powerful. Leader Nikita Khrushchev had taken a political risk. Some saw him as weak. Others saw him as a man who had saved the planet. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy knew the victory was quiet. There were no parades, no celebrations, because the world had come too close to something that could never be undone. Behind the scenes, a secret deal had been made. The United States would remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. Not publicly, not immediately, but enough to restore balance. It was a compromise that few people would know for years. Yet, the crisis left permanent marks. For the first time, both superpowers truly understood the danger. Miscommunication had nearly ended civilization. So they created something new. A direct communication line between Washington and Moscow. The hotline. A simple idea, but one that could prevent future catastrophe. Because during the crisis, messages had taken hours, sometimes days. And in nuclear war, minutes matter. The world entered a new phase of the Cold War. Still dangerous, still filled with tension, but now guided by a deeper fear. A shared understanding that total war meant total destruction. This was the birth of mutually assured destruction. Bad. A terrifying balance. Peace maintained not by trust, but by fear. Nuclear weapons continued to grow in power. Bombs stronger than anything used in atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Missiles faster. Submarines quieter. Launch systems more advanced. Humanity had created the tools to destroy itself many times over. And yet, decades passed. The world survived. Not because of technology, not because of luck, but because in 1962, two leaders chose restraint. They chose to step back. They chose survival. Today, the legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis remains. Every nuclear treaty, every diplomatic meeting, every effort to reduce tension, all shaped by those 13 days. But the danger has never fully disappeared. New nations have nuclear weapons. New conflicts rise. New tensions grow. The question that faced the world in 1962 still faces us today. Will humanity learn from history, or will it repeat it? Because the next crisis may not last 13 days. It may last minutes. If this story moved you, if you believe history must never be forgotten, subscribe to Echoes of War, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand the true cost of conflict. Because the echoes of the past are still shaping our future, and they always will.